Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our first cold chain conversation. We're not going to have much conversation if I stay on mute, so I've just unmuted, so apologies for that. Given that this is our first attempt at an event like this, I'm delighted to see so many people registered for the session and so many of you logged on already. To listen in, so for those of you to hear it, to listen in and participate in what I know will be an engaging and thought-provoking conversation. For those of you that I haven't met, I'd better introduce myself. I'm Shane Brennan, and I'm proud to be Chief Executive of the UK Cold Chain Federation. We are the representative trade association for businesses that store and move temperature-controlled goods into, out of, and around the United Kingdom. Our membership encompasses more than 150 companies, running over 500 facilities, that together account for more than 1 million square feet of chilled and frozen warehouse space. And our members also operate in excess of 30,000 temperature-controlled vehicles. We approach the topic of today's session from that operational perspective. Tom Southall, who's our Cold Chain Federation Policy Director, will speak to you in a moment about our Road to Net Zero project. And today's conversation is one of the first events on that road. And our topic is specifically about setting a baseline for that mission. You know, how do we define net zero is our job today. So what can and what perhaps more accurately, what should net zero mean for the UK cold chain? I'm incredibly grateful to our panel, who I'll shortly introduce, for joining us today and for their willingness to help us in our project. Each of them bring unique expertise to this topic, and my aim is to steer the conversation in a way that extracts just some of those insights to help us all better understand how the cold chain can and must transition from how we do things today to the net zero cold chain world. Before I introduce the panel, a word on the format for today's session. We're running today's event a bit like BBC Question Time, for those of you in the UK that know what that means. Although hopefully without any of the rudeness and point scoring that we normally see with that. I'll be playing the sort of David Dimbleby role, posing questions to the panel and letting discussion run on from there. We won't be taking verbal interventions from the audience during the session, but please share your thoughts and questions in the chat box. And I will monitor that throughout the session and bring that in at the appropriate points. If we don't address your points during the session, we'll follow up afterwards in a written report of the session. Just to manage your expectations, there's been a bit of a confusion over the time of today's session. Apologies for that. Our intention is that the session will run for around 1 hour and 15 minutes. So hopefully you'll be able to stay throughout. And if not, no problem. We'll be making our recording available after the session as a video and as a special edition of our Cold Chain podcast. So let me introduce our panel. Firstly, Professor Judith Evans from London South Bank University. Judith has over 25 years experience in researching and improving refrigeration across the food chain. She's a fellow of the Institute of Refrigeration and most recently led the successful bid for a UK Energy Research Centre grant that aims to substantially improve our understanding of sustainable cold chain systems for delivering food resilience. Welcome, Judith. Next, let me introduce Professor Alan McKinnon from Kean University. Those of you that took part in Cold Chain Live, our event in October, will have heard Alan's paper on decarbonising logistics. Maybe you've also read his book on the subject, which is definitely one of the highlights of the whole event that we ran last year. Alan brings over 4 decades of experience in researching and writing about logistics to our session. Welcome to you, Alan. Next, Professor Toby Peters, who many of you will know, I'm sure. Toby is Professor of Cold Economy at the University of Birmingham. Toby is both an inventor, having developed liquid air energy storage in the past, and is a leading researcher into system-level approaches to delivering clean cooling across the world. His work is really helping to certainly help me in the last 2 years to shape my understanding of the environmental, social, and economic impacts of cold chain, both here in the UK and across the world. Next, Dr. Tim Fox, an engineer by background and consultant on cold chain to companies, governments, and academic institutions. Tim is with us today, particularly in his capacity as the chair of the Process Industries Division of the Institute of Mechanical Engineers. He's over a number of years led their thought-leading work on developing engineering solutions that we need to deliver a sustainable cold chain. And finally, another Tim Moran, the Regional Vice President, leading the UK division of one of the world's largest cold storage and distribution businesses, Lineage Logistics. Lineage operates 14 warehouses in the UK, which by the end of this year will have the capacity to store more than 500,000 pallets of frozen food. Across the world, Lineage, which grows every single week with new announcements of acquisitions and completions of projects, operates at more than 340 facilities, representing more than 30 million cubic meters of warehouse space across the world. Tim is also the president of the UK Cold Chain Federation. So welcome to him, the boss. So that's our panel, and that's more than enough from me. So what I will do now is hand over to my colleague Tom Southall to start the discussion with a short overview of the Cold Chain Federation's Net Zero project. Okay, Tom.
Hey Shane, morning everyone, morning to the panel and everyone kind of listening in today. I think today's a really important session for us as we kind of frame our net zero project, and hopefully it's going to be a really interesting discussion for the panelists, but also for everyone listening in today. So I'm just going to spend a couple of moments, bear with me a moment, just wondering why my slides aren't moving forward. I'm just going to spend a couple of moments talking about kind of why we're here and set the scene for today's discussion. Shane mentioned our net zero project and Cold Chain Live back in October, and those that took part in that will know that that is when we launched our kind of net zero project, our kind of pledge to our members and to the industry to look at exactly what net zero might mean for the cold chain and for the businesses we represent. Within that document, we set out kind of 4 key areas where we wanted to progress the conversation and move forward in our kind of work and our understanding of that area. And those included cold storage and how we move towards a sort of lower carbon cold storage, temperature controlled distribution, and also the sort of supply chain ecosystem, so the bits and pieces that sort of knit together those facilities. But before we get to those kind of 3 kind of core issues, the first point covered in that report was how we define a net zero cold chain, and that's obviously why we've come together today to start that kind of process of looking at really what we mean when we talk about a net zero cold chain. But why is this important to kind of cold chain businesses? Why have we decided, I guess, that this is one of our key sort of policy issues as we move forward into 2021 and beyond? Well, we know from talking to members and obviously from everything that's going on around kind of green recoveries and pledges to cut UK emissions to net zero by 2050, that this is a huge issue for kind of UK industry, and one that's only going to gather momentum as we go forward towards that date. Businesses in the cold chain can expect to see sort of big changes, I think, in the next couple of decades that perhaps they haven't seen in the decades before, and that's going to be driven by pressure from customers who are expecting increasingly kind of a lower carbon, greener companies kind of providing their products, from customers as well. So in our case, perhaps that could be retailers or wholesalers or other businesses who are looking increasingly at their supply chains and expecting them to conform to certain kind of green credentials. And also from investors, we've seen a lot of investment into the cold chain recently, and that's only set to continue. And we're seeing a trend towards kind of green investment and investors looking for that kind of return for their investment from a green perspective. But also from a government approach, we know there's going to be more regulation, more policy coming out in the short term, but also medium term, long term on sort of carbon emissions, carbon targets, and for all those reasons, it's of critical importance for business to understand exactly what their obligations are within kind of net zero and within that road, and that's what our project seeks to kind of to help them with, and also to show leadership to government that, you know, as a sector we are approaching this and we are kind of meeting the challenge head on. So those are the 4 areas. Today, obviously, we're talking about defining net zero, and that's of clear importance because we can't talk about how we kind of decarbonise warehousing or distribution without kind of setting out a stall, if you like, for how we sort of baseline our emissions and how we measure progress. And that's kind of what the panel are going to be looking at today. And there's a number of ways we could do that. And there isn't one kind of, we're not going to come to a clear answer today, but what we're hoping is that the conversation today steers the Cold Chain Federation approach, and that we can with more confidence go forward and define what we mean when we talk to our members and we talk to government about a net zero cold chain. And that might be a more narrow approach where we look at just kind of UK operations and sort of warehousing and storage within and distribution within the UK, or it might mean we have to bring in some of those wider kind of perspectives, perhaps from looking at global supply chains where our food comes from kind of overseas and also where we might export, but also looking at kind of linked emissions. Can we just afford to look at the cold chain in a silo, for example, a temperature controlled vehicle? Can we just look at the refrigerated trailer and focus on that, or must we take into account the vehicle that's towing it, which perhaps isn't pure cold chain but clearly it's related? and there's a whole load of related kind of emissions, agriculture, haulage, shipping, that we might have to take into account. And this diagram you'll find within our net zero project scene setting report, which you can obviously look back on after today. But that really sets the scene. And as we move on to the kind of panel discussion, we'll be looking at that. How do we set that baseline? How do we define a net zero cold chain? What are the metrics that we must use as a sector association, but also our businesses, to monitor progress? How do we take into account some of the benefits that cold chain brings in terms of food waste and other things? And yeah, how do we link into kind of the wider emissions and the wider conversation going on around a net zero economy in the UK? So that's pretty much all I wanted to cover, Shane. I think over to you and the panel now to begin today's discussion.
Brilliant, thank you, Tom. That sets the scene very, very well. So can I ask our panelists to reveal themselves by turning on their webcams? Thank you very much. Oh, that's great. We've got, yeah. Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Great, thank you all for being with us. Right, so Tom set the scene and I've done my introductions. Hopefully you all feel like I suitably defined you in the introduction, but please correct anything as you come in from here. So I think the good way to sort of get into this and to start from is right before we get into some of the sort of more detailed questions about definitions. Can I ask you, starting with you, Judith, to give us a sense of what does the idea of a net zero cold chain mean to you?
Hi Shane. Hi everybody. Thanks for inviting me along today. It's a really complicated and difficult question you're asking. I mean, ideally, you're talking about the whole cold chain, and you're maybe talking about things even outside of the cold chain and the links that there may be. I mean, obviously, Tom highlighted you've got a refrigerated vehicle, but you've also got a big, diesel engine driving it. For me, ideally, you'd be looking at, the whole world really, and trying to decarbonize it, but it's incredibly complicated, and ultimately maybe you can only deal with what you can control. So maybe you have to really concentrate on the areas where you have influence, because otherwise it becomes such a huge problem that you really can't deal with it.
Yeah, thank you. Absolutely, that complexity absolutely comes through in everything that we talked about. Tim Fox, can I ask you to give a sense? Obviously, you've worked at this issue quite a lot within the IMechE environment for a number of years. Do you have a sort of vision for what you think net zero means for the cold chain?
Yeah, so thanks, Shane. Thanks very much, and welcome to the audience. Yeah, for me, obviously, there's the issue of net zero pieces of kit and equipment and infrastructure within the cold chain, that seamless integrated temperature controlled environment from field or fishery to consumption. And I'm sure we'll explain and explore that a bit more this morning. But for me, it goes beyond that. It's actually about also some sort of human elements as well around the systems being designed by systems thinking engineers that have sustainability at their core, and they really approach things with a highly innovative viewpoint that is looking to integrate sources of energy that traditionally aren't explored, such as waste energy and from heat, but also thinking about the system as part of a bigger system, so fully optimized with the whole energy system. So there's a lot of work to be done there around sort of education and skills development in engineers. But in addition to that, I think it's also encompasses all the actors and players that are involved in the cold chain, including the logistics managers that are optimizing with sustainability at their core, maintenance and service being done by technicians and engineers that have sustainability at their core. So for me, it's much more than just the sort of the central question about net zero kit and equipment. It's a different way of thinking.
Yeah, well, that is a neat segue into you, Toby. obviously who's probably written most of everyone about systems in cold chain and how that fits together. Do you have a sense of say in 2050, what does the optimum best look like ambition for us to set for ourselves around a net zero cold chain?
Yeah, can I just perhaps, I think it's also helpful just to rewind and why we're doing this as well. You know, we've been warned that at the moment we're looking at the world being increasing temperature by about 3 degrees by 2100. And along with making vast tracts of the world uninhabitable without continuous artificial temperature management, this is going to have big impacts on climate systems. So we're going to see the permafrost thaw out, which will release methane, which will create further problems. So we've set this target to actually save the planet and save our society and save our future. And we need to get to limit warming to 1.5. To do that, we need to achieve this target of net zero. Net zero, I think, has got often, it's very much focused on electric vehicles and renewable electricity. But the key point here is obviously that much of our energy demand is for cooling and heating, so it's thermal loads. And last year, the climate action pathway to net zero cooling was set. And the aim is to save 260 gigatons of CO2 equivalent by 2050. So that's the target that we're playing into within this sector. 260 gigatons, which is about 8 years of global emissions. They define net zero cooling as reducing greenhouse gas emissions from cooling during the operational life of products, excluding the resource extraction and the manufacturing, to as close to zero as possible, and any remaining GHG emissions, direct and indirect, balanced with an equivalent amount of carbon removal, so by planting forests and through direct carbon capture and storage. So that's sort of where the United Nations, the roadmap to zero, has defined it. It's this reduce the emissions from the operational life of products. For me, to say what does the world look like in 2050, I think there are many things which will happen before then, which will shape that. But I do think the point is that there are three things. It's around how do we reduce the demand for cooling, so avoid cooling demand by building design, by all the options we can do, behavioral change to mitigate the need by efficient chains. How can we shift how we do cooling? So that's not just shift to natural refrigerants, but also shift to harnessing waste energy, waste heat, waste cold to provide it. And of course, how can we improve and have ultra efficient systems? So for me, what will cooling look like in 2050, or what will the cold chain look like? It will look where we are as close to possible as zero, and we've achieved that not simply by focusing on energy efficient technologies, but avoiding capturing all the opportunities for waste heat, waste cold aggregation, as well as deployed best-in-class solutions.
That's really helpful, Toby. Thank you. Alan, can you sort of build on that? I know that you've looked at this in the wider sense of the whole of logistics and not specifically about cold chain, but how do you sort of envision the kind of idea of decarbonisation by 2050 within logistics as a whole?
Yeah, okay, thank you. Just one slight correction. My university is the Kuna Logistics University. You missed the word logistics. Otherwise, you're forgiven for that. Okay, yeah, again, picking up on what Toby was saying, I mean, there are some general issues I think we have to consider. One of the key ones here is the boundary issue. I mean, where we draw the boundary around the cold chain in terms of the range of activities, but also geographically as well, as you pointed out. And if we get back to the fundamentals of net zero, you know, clearly there are some sectors which will overshoot the zero carbon target. I mean, these are the hard to abate sectors, and I think logistics is regarded as a hard to abate sector, and therefore we're not going to get all our activities down to zero. I mean, if you look at the European Commission's targets for transport, it's not a 100% reduction in emissions by 2050, it's a 90% reduction. So they can see there will still be CO2 and other greenhouse gases emitted by transport by 2050. and they will have to be compensated then by drawing down, greenhouse gases already in the atmosphere. So, so the first thing, obviously, in this sector, you've got to get your emissions as low as possible. We concede that there will have to be some compensation. The issue is, to what extent can that compensation be achieved internally within this sector? I mean, what some people now call insetting, where there are activities within the sector which will actually be carbon negative and will actually compensate. I mean, as an example, covering a warehouse roof with solar panels, for example. I mean, there's a great example in the Netherlands of a new warehouse called the Tube in Tilburg, where the solar panels don't just generate enough electricity to power the activities in the warehouse, but also to power houses in the surrounding area. So there's an example of carbon. But even going beyond that, you may have to get to carbon offsetting, where you're not going to do this carbon compensation within the sector, but you have to rely on others to do it on your behalf. And the hope is that that carbon offsetting will be minimized, clearly, because if every sector sees carbon offsetting as a way to get to net zero, then we have a problem at a planetary level, and so that will not actually work. And just backtracking a bit to a point that Tom made in his introduction about whether the cold chain should only relate to refrigeration activities, I think that's too narrow a definition. I think if one looks at trucking operations, you also have to look at all the emissions from the motive power as well as the refrigeration. And some of the calculations I've done recently suggest that the motive power can be 85% of the total energy and emissions in the trucking operation, and the refrigeration only about 14%. So I would be arguing for a more holistic view on all of this. Okay.
Brilliant, thank you, Alan. That's great. So Tim, over to you as the operator in the room, the one that's actually doing cold chain of all of us. Do you have a sense within you personally or within Lineage of what net zero might look like for your business?
And the answer is probably not at this moment in time. I think what you listen to is that the issue is extremely complicated. Probably from an operator's mind, you see it in very, very simple ways, that we consume lots of carbon, whether it be through electricity, whether it be through diesel, to keep product cool and to transport products around the place. And because of that, anybody who talks about 2050 and net zero and what that means looks very scary from an operator point of view, because nobody can come along and particularly tell us what that looks like. So there's a statement out there, but nobody really gives you a roadmap to say this is what you need to be doing. And from a business point of view, you're probably looking at it from a few different strands. You're looking at it from a pure commercial aspect of commercially, what does that mean to me? How do I trade in the future? How does my business stay sustainable? There's an ethical standpoint that says, what should I be doing now to make things better, and how will that work? And then sort of the question that I was thinking about is that actually from our customers' standpoint and from our suppliers' standpoint, how does a customer want us to act in a net zero sustainable way, which drives generally our business process, our customers saying this is what we want from you, and also our suppliers who are supplying us trucks, trailers, TRUs, electricity, refrigeration units within the cold stores. How are they facing the challenge? And what are they doing within their business? Because I think what was said before is the total supply chain. Not just the supply chain of how we move food, but the supply chain of how food is stored, kept safe, and got to the consumer. That this encompasses. So when you really start to drill in it from an operator's point of view, you think, wow, this is just, I'm a simple person. I move product across cold stores. I move pallets of product and deliver them to places when people ask to do. And now we're being asked to take on incredibly complex challenges and come up with a solution that, can be the rise and fall of your business. And of course, the other thing is that today, lots of cold storage operators, including Lineage Logistics, are making investments that are going to be there in the next 30 years. We're laying millions and millions of pounds down that still have a life in 30 years' time? And are we doing the right thing today with our pounds and dollars to be there in 30 years' time? Or actually are we building white elephants that, you know, are not going to be fit for purpose in the future? So huge topic, delighted to be here today to be part of it, because, you know, uncomplicating this in my mind would be super important, and I have a feeling that it's something that's going to run for some time.
Yeah, I think, yeah, we're definitely going to solve it in the next hour. That's for sure. Just quickly, Tim, before we move on, I want to make sure you know, I think this point about seeing it in the context of 2050 is daunting. But obviously, as a business, there are things that you are doing now. Like you say, you're building a lot of space. There are innovations that you are investing in your business today that are part of, or at least contributing to, the idea of achieving efficiency, if not net zero.
Absolutely.
Just a couple of words on that.
Go hand in hand. I mean, from a business point of view, the vast majority of things that are going to save carbon are going to save us money, and are probably good investments anyway. So, you know, the solar panels that we've got on 12 of our 14 sites, you know, we're looking at increasing the number of solar panels that we do. As an example, we've just done a 2 million, or we're in the process of a 2 million project on changing the refrigeration over a Bells Hill depot from, you know, 30-year-old plant to the most modern plant available. Now, you know, it's a capital expense, but it's going to save energy because we're going to consume less electricity. From a TRU point of view, you know, we've got the solar panels on top of one of our trailers at the moment that we're trialing to see whether that's going to, you know, what effect that has. We're looking at, you know, regenerative energy from braking and axles to power. So we're looking at all sorts of things that have a carbon saving, and you know, are the right things to do from a sustainability point of view. But they are very swayed to a commercial angle, because from a business point of view, it's difficult to justify making an investment into something that's going to cost you money in the long term. To remove carbon, if there's no benefit to doing that.
Thank you, Tim. I think that's really, really useful at this point. I'm going to move on to ask specifically about this issue of scope of cold chain and what is the cold chain before we get into defining the metrics for it. But one of the things I capture from you, which I'll come back to after that, is the issue of who's going to set the definition. Is it going to be the logistics operators? Is it going to be their customers? Is it going to be government? I think we'll come to that as a question after next, if that makes sense. But the first one is this issue of, and Tom introduced it, we've touched on it a little bit already, but let's sort of focus in on it. When we talk about the cold chain, how do we set the sort of scope and parameters of that? And, or how can we? What are the different models we could use for defining the scope of cold chain in a way that's going to achieve measurable ways of arriving at information, data that we can then act on? Perhaps, Judith, can I ask you to give us a sense on that? I know something you've looked at and researched in the past.
Again, you're not asking us easy questions, but I mean, you touched on this, I guess, in the introduction and your question about whether you, a lamb from New Zealand, you should be including everything from the point that it's born through the point it's slaughtered, transported, stored in this country and goes to the consumer, and then you start also including you know, things like food waste as well. You start including the manufacture and end of life of equipment as well. So these definitions can get incredibly complicated, and if you start including every part, it probably becomes rather unmanageable. So I think you've got to start trying to define the cold chain, and as I said before, I think really you can only deal with what you can manage yourself. It's not possible for you to really manage at the moment how New Zealanders farm their lamb, for example. It would be nice if you did have that sort of links and influence, and so the whole of the cold chain was considered holistically and everybody was involved, and you know, as others have said, you were sharing energy between you, not only within the cold chain but outside of it as well, and usefully using all sources of energy, you know, waste heat, waste cooling. But you know, these are things that we should be looking at, I definitely think. But, you know, if you want to look for something you are doing today, I think you can only look first at what you can control yourself, but then you need to very fast start looking at how you could interact possibly with other sectors.
The question that occurs to me on the back of that, Judith, is, and then maybe I'll bring in Toby on that, is are we as the cold chain operators, and by that I mean logistics people, so people who are running warehouses, people running trucks, either as an individual business or as a contributor to a wider business, are we a part of somebody else's net zero plan? Or are we a net zero plan in our own right? And I think, Toby, you obviously come at it very strongly from the point of view of the cold chain as an entity and a force in its own right. And I think that's probably how you sort of come at things. Is that, would I be right to characterize it in that way? How do you see it?
At the end of the day, you know, the climate challenge is a global problem. So we can't, you know, we can't sort of abdicate ourselves from the global system and the global solution. I totally agree with what Judith is saying, is that operators, you know, can only do those areas where they can get their hands around and shouldn't be expected necessarily to be responsible for the how lamb is produced or shipped to the port. However, in solving the challenge of cold chain and in solving the challenge of climate, we have to recognize that it is an integrated system. And so if you want to build in the efficiencies, if you want to reduce food loss, it's how does the whole system work together? And we're seeing that, you know, if you look at, say, COVID-19 and vaccination, people have realized this system has to work right the way from the point of manufacture to the point of injection, otherwise you lose vaccines. So I think you've got to look at it vertically and horizontally. As an operator, yes, you focus on what you can do to improve those areas you work in. However, you have to remember, for example, if you operate a warehouse, sooner or later you're going to have electric vehicles turning up there, which will need to be charged, and you need to make sure that you can have the infrastructure to charge them. So suddenly you start becoming part of the system. But equally at the same time, and that's why I think the work that we're doing is actually try to understand this from a system and see how we can work collaboratively to find the answers for how can the whole system be efficient, right the way from the food producer to the consumer. Because also it's the flow of data across the whole system which will drive a lot of efficiencies. So data needs to be at the system level to support it. But it is, as you said, it's a big challenge. I think at the moment a lot of our traditional approaches are sort of quite reductionist, so testing individual pieces of equipment. We're not looking at thermal networks. We're not looking at how we can harness, not necessarily in the UK, but the waste heat, the waste cold of LNG to drive cold chain. So the big wins will come from system level thinking, but that isn't something which the operators can be expected to drive. But what we need to do is stimulate the discussion at that aggregation of everybody rather than just individuals.
Yeah, Tim Fox, I'm going to bring you in. Can I ask you sort of to reflect on, Alan McKinnon mentioned this in his comment just now, which is the idea that actually for logistics, the objective by 2050 might not be to achieve a zero carbon emission model. It might be that actually it's, as part of an overarching system, there actually might still be producing an amount of carbon because that necessity based on the technology available even by 2050, but that they will be contributing to the overall achievement of net zero on a system-wide basis. From an engineering perspective, is that something you buy into as a concept, that there will still be people that do emit and people that actually potentially take the carbon out in the system, and we have to sort of set our objectives in that context, or is that trying to be too much of a cop-out?
So is that aimed at me, Shane?
Yeah, it was Tim. Yeah, sorry, Tim.
Okay, sorry, when you said engineering, but you're still looking at Toby. Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay. So a couple of things there. One, you know, from a pure engineering perspective, completely don't buy into the idea that there's any offsetting involved. You know, I think one has to strive as innovatively and as passionately as you can to get to net zero in your system without having any offsetting. But you know, we do have to work in the real world, so there will be trade-offs in that. But I think to start with offsetting on the table is a misguided point of start. I just wanted to pick up, if I may, Shane, on a couple of things that both Judith and Toby have said. So I agree with Judith that, you know, ultimately it's an incredibly complex challenge, and as Alan has said and Toby has said, you know, you have to be cognizant of the system boundaries, and you have to define a system that you can deal with. And as everybody said, you know, that an operator can only deal with what they're directly responsible for. But there are a couple of other dimensions in there, in the operators have an opportunity to influence others in their activities. So although they can't be responsible for what goes on in New Zealand in farming of lamb, they can have a voice and a statement about what their position is on that, and to you know, bring pressure to bear on not only their suppliers but their customers, you know, to start thinking in a net zero way and from a more sustainable perspective. So there's influence there. They have direct influence, of course, over their own individual supply chain that's providing their kit, providing their energy, so they're, you know, supplying them with consultancy services or whatever. So there are real influence points there. But I think also beyond that, I think operators and a much broader cold chain community now have to be much more open possibly to collaboration, and to get that tension right between you know, collaborative partnerships and collaborative speaking and collaborative action, as opposed the tension that creates with their commercial operations that has to be resolved in some way. There has to be some understanding that this is only really going to be achieved through data sharing and through collaboration and partnership if we're going to get to where we have to go. And then my final point is really that we, you know, for a lot of this, we haven't got the time, you know, from an engineering perspective, we just have not got the time to get to, you know, to discuss, debate, develop the perfect solutions. As Tim was saying, you know, he's building things today that will be here in 2030 and 2040 and 2050 and through to 2070 quite possibly. So, you know, we need action today on the ground to do the best we possibly can with what we've got, whilst in parallel we're developing all the protocols, the methodologies, the approaches that we need, and what we need to do while we're taking that action on the ground is do our best to try to build in flexibility and to avoid lock-in of inflexible solutions, and to ensure that, you know, we do the best we can to avoid unintended consequences, which is a difficult task, I admit, but it requires some thinking around, you know, if we take this action, what possibly could be the unintended consequences across the system.
Thank you, Tim. So, Tim Moran, I'm putting you on notice that I'm going to ask you to talk about data and visibility and stuff that Lineage is doing in that area, both in the UK but across the world. Alan, can I ask you for some help for us on where are the places we should be looking for good measuring systems for measuring carbon impacts that might apply in the supply chain?
Yeah, I can certainly provide some advice on that. The situation today is a lot better than it was when I first got involved in this about 2007, 2008, when there were many different methodologies, different reporting standards, and a company approaching this from scratch had a problem in deciding which one would be the most appropriate. Thankfully, since then, there has been convergence. So if you're not aware of it, there's an organization called the Global Logistics Emissions Council, been working since 2014 to harmonize methodologies and reporting standards for logistical activity across all transport modes. In 2019, they published their revised methodology. They've now got a lot of traction. I think that about 100 big multinationals now use GLEC. You increasingly see companies reporting figures that are GLEC compliant. Again, all their stuff's available online. So it's international, and I think that's one I would recommend. And also working with the ISO so that their systems will become ISO accredited as well. That's for the basic measurement. In terms of getting the business onto the right carbon reducing trajectory that will get to net zero by 2050, I would also mention the science-based targeting initiative. I think there are now over 1,000 companies worldwide which are working with science-based targeting, moving away from carbon intensity targets, because I think until recently an awful lot of corporate targets were carbon intensity ones relating emissions to some level of activity, but that's not what the planet needs. It's not what governments require. We've got to get the absolute emissions down, and so science-based targeting doesn't. At the moment, they're working with, I think, 9 sectors. There's a transport sector in which a few logistics companies are involved, like DHL and DB Schenker. I don't think many of the companies in that 1,000 are in the cold chain at the moment, so I think there's maybe work to be done there. But I think there's a more general point here, Shane, because you said, you know, is it this sector that will have to devise its procedures and its standards and so forth? I don't think it should. I think what it does should be aligned with these international initiatives as well, so that there's consistency between what's happening in this sector and what's happening more generally, for example, in the logistics sector.
Thank you. And that science-based thing, I think that some of the retail companies globally probably are driving towards the more science-based targeting, and that probably is the entry point into that for some logistics companies that are servicing them going forward. So it feels to me like that might be one of the sort of the near future sort of biting points for some of the cold chain operators in seeing these kinds of metrics. Tim, as I said, can I ask you to say a bit about how Lineage is seeing the opportunities of data and data visibility within your operations to help you to potentially establish baselines for this kind of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So Lineage, #1 in the world for temperature controlled operations, clearly a huge consumer of electricity and carbon. And of course, when we're looking at our sustainable operations, we're looking about how this business moves forwards into the future and hits head on the challenges of the future. So one of the things that Lineage did is that they set up a data science team in San Francisco. And basically their job is just to harvest data from everything we do across the cold chain, because that's what our, the vast majority of our operations are. Over 99% of everything we do is involved in the cold chain. So from a data science point of view and from a warehouse point of view, they're fitting 1,000 probes to a warehouse. They're looking for hotspots across warehouses. They're looking, they're clamping every area that they can within the site. So every compressor, everything that's taking energy, they're clamping that compressor and using IoT to send data back from everything that's happening in the warehouse, and we're bringing that data in. Now, Lineage has grown over the last 12 years and is a family of many businesses, as well as new builds and expansions. So you can imagine across the estate of sort of over 300 warehouses, the difference in warehouse design, the difference in refrigeration design, the difference in throughputs and all, even the difference in having one in Texas and having one in in the north of Canada. They're just the temperature variances that you get there, and we're harvesting all that data, and we've got a team of data scientists that are also out lecturing across the world on things like this themselves, who are taking that data and trying to work out what is the right thing to do in the future, but also how we can move the dial within the existing operations. So for us, everything sits around data. Everything's plugged in. In the UK, what we're specifically doing is we're working with our refrigeration engineers, and we've got their systems on board. So we've been upgrading a lot of our plant into the newest systems, and we're using their systems to harvest that data and giving them the option to look at that as well and be able to enhance the operations. And all this sits around for us an operator as money saving, of course, but really has a carbon sort of benefit to it as well. From a transportation point of view, you know, we do the same again. All our trucks and trailers are all wired up. We're seeing data coming through on all that. Our data scientists have done lots and lots of work again about modelling trucks and routes and optimization and where the opportunities are. One of the studies they did in the US was they said, look, we moved to electric trucks, and they basically route mapped you know, what they did over a month on electric trucks and worked out what the impact would be for that. So, you know, we're doing lots and lots of work, and I absolutely agree. You know, the devil's in the detail. It all sits within the data of how you get there. The challenges is that it's okay having all this data, but if UK retail decides that it doesn't want to order 26 pallets, it only want to order 20 pallets on the truck, then I've got 6 pallets worth of space. Now I can become more carbon efficient by telling them that they should put them extra 6 on. If they don't want them, they don't want them. And so the challenge is that we can have all this data and we can present it, but individual business challenges and individual business within the business, departments within the business have their own KPIs, and not all those KPIs are carbon benefiting KPIs. They're cost reduction programs and ways of looking at things. So to influence the whole supply chain, even from an operator point of view, where we can see areas of influence, so we can control what we can control until the person that we're dealing with doesn't want us to control it because it doesn't fit their metrics at this point in time. You know, you're always pushing against, you know, a fairly heavy door, really, to try and change the dial on some of these things. So you know, from what I would say from an operator, you know, we're very, very advanced. You know, Fast Company magazine has listed us as, I think we were number 17 or something like that for our use in data science. We got a number 1 spot for our applied science work as well. So, you know, we're doing everything we can because we believe the devil's in the detail. But having that detail is great. You have to have a willing audience who all want to talk about the same thing as you. Otherwise, you're collecting data, and it's not really making too much of a difference.
Jude, thank you. That's great. Judith, that brings me to thinking about some of your work. How important is marginal gain in this? You know, slightly moving on from the conversation of how you define it. I know this is an area where you've done a lot of work around how you can achieve a lot of impact through better housekeeping, better operation, better management of your facility. So do you sort of see resonance in what Tim's saying in terms of sort of some of the work you've done in the past and ongoing around those sorts of issues?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds fantastic what Lineage are doing in collecting data. I mean, one of the questions is what you do with the data when you collect it, you know, and how you manage it and act from it. I mean, one of the things is you can make quite a few marginal gains, and they all add up. I mean, in work that we did a few years ago on cold stores, and things may have moved on a bit since then, to be fair, but we were finding on average across a range of cold stores, you could save about 30% of the energy. It was obviously a lot more in some stores and a lot less in others, and it depended on the area and the type of cold store, but still there were significant savings to be made. But I don't believe that just applying energy savings opportunities alone are going to get us to zero carbon. Yeah. You know, and some of these savings, they're not just technical, they're behavioural and operational as well, and that's also incredibly important. So short term, you know, there's quite a few incremental savings that can be made to carbon, but you know, long term, there's got to be a lot more than that. You know, we've got to be looking at integration and how we act across the whole of the cold chain, and you know, possibly with other actors who are close to our cold chains.
Great. So that's that. So then we've talked a bit about we talked about definitions. We talked about who might set the definitions. We haven't mentioned the G word yet, and the role of government, whether it's international government or UK government structures. To what extent isn't it just their job to tell us what the targets are, what we need to achieve, and then that is the framework upon which we respond. I don't know, Toby, you've been probably as involved as anybody in conversation with governments in the plural. Do you see that as the main route through to coming up with a definition and then targets that we then match against, or not?
Well, I don't think it's the job of government to tell the industry this is the specific target or whatever action you have to do. And I think the job of industry is to help work with government to hit the net zero target. I think the job of government, and picking up on what Tim said and we've heard elsewhere, is that we're not going to get to this integrated, energy efficient, technology and economic optimized net zero cold chain organically, given all the actors involved. As Tim said about the logistics company and the retailer have to work together. So I think part of it is the job of government is to actually catalyze and enable all the actors to come together to work out what the solutions are as a system to meet our climate targets, to meet our energy security and also our food security. Because the other thing government has to do is, in driving at its net zero target, we have to remember, as we are learning day to day at the moment, you know, the cold chain is a backbone of our society. So it's essential for our food cold chain. It's essential for our food growers, our farmers, our fishers. It's essential for our health. So one of the jobs of government it isn't simply to set a net zero target. It's actually to understand what are our changing cooling needs. What cooling do we require in 2050 so that we meet the societal challenge and the environmental challenge simultaneously. So from my perspective, what government should be doing now, and they've done that with the project Judith and I working on, but they need to do it far more, because at the moment, cooling and cold chain is still a bit of a blind spot versus heating. But actually, when, as I said, when you look at it, COVID-19 immunization is dependent on a cold chain, right? So what government should be doing is investing far more in actually defining what are the solutions to system level, energy efficient, needs driven cold chains to meet the challenge of 2050. What does that need to look like? That's the problem. We don't know actually how much cold chain we require in 2050.
Incredibly powerful point that, you know, we're not talking about sort of going down from where we are now. We're going to need a lot more cooling across cold chain, and air conditioning between now and 2050 than we currently have. So it's and in a warming world. Yeah, in a warming world.
So that's going to drive more energy demand for cooling simply because the world's getting warmer.
Any other thoughts on that from anyone on the panel? I'm conscious I keep picking on you rather than letting you come in. Alan?
Yeah, I entirely agree with what Toby has just said. I mean, I don't know that the government is necessarily going to target the cold chain sector and say, here are targets and this is what you should be doing. In a sense, if you look at the various components here, government will influence that. So government will influence the decarbonisation of electricity, you know, which is actually progressing very well in the UK, and that's obviously going to help the sector to decarbonise. Again, it will target road freight, for example, and that will also influence the sector. So, but the thing is, we have this 2050 target of net zero. That's a long way off, and you can understand why many companies think, well, that's just outside our planning horizon at the moment. This is for future generations of logistics managers to deal with. So what we need are meaningful interim targets. You know, we therefore have to define a trajectory. That the government does that at an aggregate level with its carbon budgets. You know, it's 4, 6 carbon budgets. The trouble is, it's not really going to hit any of those carbon budgets at the moment. And so the government as a whole is not really on the right path that's going to get us to 2050. Just backtracking to some of the points that were made earlier by Tim Moran. Obviously, your company, Lineage, has great analytical capabilities here. It's got access to all the data. You're consuming the energy. But for some companies in this sector, they won't have that data available. And so many of them will therefore have to use some industry standard values. And it's worth drawing attention to the fact that every year, EFRA and BIS in the UK publishes this huge spreadsheet with emission factor data, with average figures, that when companies are getting started in measuring their emissions, this is a good way to start, to use some of these more generic industry values. And then once you build up the internal capability to measure your emissions yourself, then you can replace those with your own values. But I mean, as I was pointing out to Shane just yesterday, I mean, under road freight transport, there's a whole section there on the sort of average values, carbon emission values for refrigerated transport. And that gives companies a way of getting started in all of this, it seems to me, before delaying until sometime in the future when you've got a data collection capability. I mean, in the meantime, you can be using these average values.
Thanks, that's great. That's a really important point. Tim Fox, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, just a couple of points there, just picking up on a few things there. So in terms of the role of government, I think for me, there are three key roles of government here. There's clearly the whole issue of setting the vision, which is what the whole sort of 2050 target is around. But clearly, you know, they have to set a big vision, a broad vision for the UK, and the cold chain has to fit within that as part of the whole system. But beyond that, I think there are a couple of things they need to do that are very specific. They need to remove barriers, so they need to work with the industry and work with the professions that are involved in the industry to help identify barriers within the policy landscape where the government can make interventions to remove those barriers to the industry achieving a net zero outcome. I think also they have a big role to play in driving innovation in areas where we have gaps. There's still a lot of gaps that need to be filled, and they need innovative R&D and innovative engineering to fill them. And I think there's a definite role for them there through their support programs to drive that innovation. But they need to work with the industry to find those sweet points for innovation. And then thirdly, I think there's a big role for them in ensuring that we have a fully trained and skilled workforce, both you know, in terms of, again, I'm coming at this from an engineering perspective, but both in terms of engineers and technicians that think differently about the system that they're working within, and think more broadly about the system, where their particular piece fits within the system, and they think more holistically and more innovative around how they design, how they maintain, and how they service these systems. So I think there's three areas there where, you know, government really does have a role to play in terms of its policy and its regulatory environment.
That's great. Toby, anyone come in? Can I ask you to make your point, but also to ask you a question about where you think the UK currently ranks and whether the UK could rank in terms of its approach to this issue within cold chain context compared to other places and other markets in the world?
Okay, so I think the first point is that we've got a fundamental problem, and picking up on what Tim said, is that when we talk about energy, inherently the government means electricity, and when it talks about energy storage, it means batteries. But actually, once you start thinking thermally and you look at cooling as a thermal challenge, not an electrical challenge, you know, you can do many other things which need to be really understood and invested in. So thermal energy storage is potentially a far better solution for warehouses or on vehicles than necessarily just using batteries and electricity. But it's not given the same the same priority and the same focus. And that sort of leads on to then your second point. The problem is that in the UK, I think we're first and foremost focused on electricity, and now obviously we're focused on heating because the big part of our CO2 is from heating. So we're not a country which requires massive volumes of cooling because that's inherently driven out of air conditioning. So it is, we talk about, we see stuff talking about heating and cooling, but cooling is the poor relation to heating in the UK. You go to India, you go to the GCC, you go to Africa, it's all around the cooling agenda, because over there, it's actually most of their energy, thermal energy consumption is for cooling loads driven by the air conditioning. So, we're starting to see that change, but I think that when you look at the global actions around cooling and cold chain, it is being driven out of different markets at the moment because they are the markets where cooling is much more prevalent. So as I said, India, cooling action plans, China, so on and so forth. That said, it's all around the reason why the cold chain is so important, because it is global, and you know, our food chain does actually start with the small farmers in Africa or India as much as the farmers in the UK, if not more so for many sectors. So we are seeing now the UK government actively support things like the Africa Centre of Excellence for Sustainable Cooling and Cold Chain, which I'm working on with Judith and others in Rwanda, and similar projects. So I think we are, the UK has been to date focused on electricity and heating, but I do think that we're now starting to see that the cooling, and specifically the cold chain, is rising up the agenda. And, you know, given its global opportunity, we're seeing, what is it, 13 to 18 cooling devices deployed per second globally. You know, this is a big market for us.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you for that, Toby. I'm conscious of the time. I'm just going to quickly summarize some of the comments that have come in, because I think it's, thank you to everyone that has been making comments through the session. Sort of 2 or 3 comments have come in really about some of the practical things you can do to drive your performance now, particularly around strong maintenance and the issues around marginal gain in cleaning and maintenance of existing facilities. I've got a question about the idea of accreditation for businesses that are doing well in this sector. How do we reward, you know, if we measure and we achieve, how do we demonstrate that in a way that creates a commercial opportunity and return for business? I think that's an area that we absolutely need to explore as the Federation, because I think there are potentially opportunities in that area. And then I've got a question here on about energy use. So basically issues, particularly about the issue of, I think we talked about this a little bit in the panel, but the idea of the waste energy that generates in the cold chain, how we properly redistribute that, and how that might be a contributor to achieving carbon targets through effectively offsetting, but offsetting in a very practical way, not planting trees somewhere else in the world in order to compensate for your performance. So thank you to everyone for all those. What we'll do is we'll follow up on these specific points that have come in during this panel and in the follow-up. Can I ask a kind of final question to the panel before I ask Tom Southall to summarize overall? The question for me really is how optimistic are you about the path to net zero for the cold chain through to 2050, understanding the point about milestones along the way? Maybe Tim Moran, can I ask you to start?
Yeah, you can if you like. Optimistic. Yeah. Until I would defer optimism until I saw a realistic roadmap of how an operator should get there, and what am I expected to do. And I'll take one example. If I'm to run electric trucks instead of diesel, then how does that happen? And that's that's just one example. I haven't got enough power into the majority of my depots to charge electric trucks up. I'll over my capacity, and the UK hasn't got enough power capacity to deal with electric trucks in total. So I sit in a place that goes, yeah, we'll invest. UK logistics, cold chain logistics is very good at investing into things and being sustainable in its own right, even with a dictatorial way of governing us. We'll sort of get there, because we do. Whether that'll affect food prices, perhaps, who knows? But things will. We can change, we can adapt. Everybody's got to eat. We'll still move the product, however we're going to do that. But practically, how does it work? So my optimism will be, see a roadmap, tell me how it's going to happen, and then I'll be exceptionally optimistic that we can meet that challenge. But until I see that, I have no idea how to meet the challenge. So I'm pessimistic about the ability in the future of it.
Thank you for that. Judith, do you want to go next? Optimistic or pessimistic?
Okay. Well, always like to be optimistic, but I tend to concur with quite a few things that Tim said. For me, change is not happening fast enough. We've got to make change quickly. Otherwise, we're stacking up huge issues, 10, 20 years ahead, and we've got to then move even faster then. So we've got to be moving now. We're not moving fast enough. it's not just technology, that's really important, but we've got to look at operational issues. We've got to look at integration, and nobody's really doing this practically at the moment. And I think, you know, we need to be moving these issues forward faster. That's my reservation really at the moment.
Understood. I think everyone kind of has a similar feeling about it. But Tim Fox, your turn. Optimistic, pessimistic?
Yeah. So thank you. Yeah, I'm broadly optimistic. I think that given the groundwork that organisations like the Cold Chain Federation, yourself, Jane, and others are doing now, and the sort of broader picture of what's going on across the energy system, I'm broadly optimistic. And I think given the sort of comments I've heard from Tim and others that are on the ground in the industry, actually trying to do the best they possibly can today with the tools and the knowledge that they have available to them, I'm overall optimistic.
Brilliant. And Alan, your thoughts?
Optimistic, positive, pessimistic, too binary. I suppose I tend a bit more to the pessimistic side for a number of reasons. I think one is the projected growth in the demand for freight movement, particularly temperature controlled freight movement, which is going to make it harder. If you look at how governments are thinking of decarbonising logistics, attaching a lot of importance to modal shift onto rail. I mean, if you look at the EU Green Deal statement come out in December, almost entirely thinking of decarbonisation by getting more freight onto rail. That doesn't help cold chain very much. The railways are not very good at moving temperature controlled product. And then we get into different powertrain technologies for trucks. And getting back to what Tim Fox said earlier, you know, time is so limited, we cannot be disagreeing on the fundamentals here, but that's precisely what we're doing in the road freight sector. You know, is it going to be hydrogen, batteries, catenaries? Each have got a lobby pressing for this, and it's hard to know what the real. And also, even when we do that, it's going to take us, I don't know, 15 years to transform the truck fleet away from diesel into these alternative technologies. So everything I said so far is a bit negative. Two positives: we've not said anything at all about the monetization of carbon emissions. I mean, if you look at the World Bank's dashboard for carbon pricing, the schemes either in operation or being developed, if they were all implemented, it would cover about a quarter of greenhouse gas emissions, you know, where a monetary value would be attached to CO2, putting it onto company balance sheets. That would be a game changer. And the second thing is digitalization, which I think offers huge potential for improving load factors and improving the routing of trucks, where there's going to be a significant carbon saving. And that's not just applying to the cold chain sector. I mean, that's all road freight operations. So a balance of positives and negatives.
That's great. Yeah, I wouldn't expect a binary answer from an academic in any situation, Alan. So thank you for that. And Toby, so over to you for your analysis of where you will sit on the optimism pessimism scale through to 2050.
Well, I think we've got to first of all remember we've got a number of jobs we've got to do. We've got to deliver net zero, but we actually also need to feed 10 billion people and provide them with the pharmacy and the vaccines they require, and also recognise that a lot of our food chain starts with small farmers in Africa and India. So looking at a global level, we must deliver net zero and our social goals at the same time. It's not either or. So that's the first binary position. We've got to do both and now. I think that I'm like Alan, sort of sitting there. There are some positive negatives, but the one thing I think we should take away is I think there is a big transition now from talking about it, from little fixes, to actually people really recognising, governments recognising that we have to get a pathway to zero. I don't think, as we've heard today, we've got the pathway to zero, but I do think that there is now a sense of urgency with governments that they need to make this happen. So I'm sort of probably far more optimistic today than I was even 12 months ago, because I do think that one of the things which is going to come out of the past 12 months and COVID is this transition to renewables, to pathway to zero, and therefore one has to hope that we will move fast enough.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Tom Southall, I'm assuming you're there. Can you come in and join us? And just basically carrying on the optimism theme, can you give everyone a kind of sense of momentum from here? So obviously it's been a really, really helpful and insightful conversation we've had in the last hour or so. How are we going to capture all of that, and then how does that take us forward in our net zero project? Yeah,
thanks, Shane. And I think that was a fascinating discussion. I'm not sure I've got the easiest task of trying to summarise and move forward with that, so you might forgive me for looking down at my notes. But yeah, I think it's quite clear it's quite it's such a difficult area, but I think some clear themes have kind of come out in terms of perhaps how we move forward with this. I think when we look at kind of what we try and you know, that core question of kind of defining the cold chain, I think I really like Judith's kind of expression of you know, we can only look at what we can control, but clearly that's only works to a certain extent, and as Tim Moran pointed out, we need to involve, you know, our members' customers in that, and involve more people in that conversation when we look at kind of how we move products around the UK. But we also have that duty to look beyond at kind of global measures as well, use our expertise to help others share kind of expertise in that way, and use that influence. So it almost seems to me like a bit of a sort of staggered approach to, we look kind of in-house first, but we're always looking to influence others and look to where we can kind of work with those two and learn things. I think Alan shared some really useful ways that we can measure, and I think that was one of the key things we were trying to look at today, is how we measure emissions in the cold chain. And Alan, I think, mentioned 3 really great ways that we can look into further at looking how we kind of baseline, or at least how we try and estimate the kind of carbon footprint of the cold chain. So that's certainly something we were looking further, and hopefully Alan will help us with. And that will help us perhaps to look towards that kind of where we are now. And then perhaps the difficulty I think that's coming through is that 2050, where we actually sit at that point. It's clear that, you know, we need more cold, and that's growing. And I think that's the big difficulty in looking at those incremental ways that we get there, is that endpoint. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I think that's something we can look into, or perhaps we look shorter term to those incremental gains first. And we heard from Tim around all the great things that are already going on, and we need to make sure that we kind of factor those in to that thinking as well, and account for those. And I think the key thing for kind of measurement is looking from a sector perspective and then an individual business. Clearly there's lots we can do to support an individual business to look at their individual emissions through some of the ways Alan described, perhaps looking at, you know, the accreditation system that you mentioned. I think we had at the comment chain. So I think there's that 2-tier as well, perhaps looking at it from a sector perspective, both within the UK and globally, but also at an individual business level as well. And then finally, I think the work with government came through quite strongly, how critical that is to understand the overall government objectives and direction, and how we fit into that, the support we might need from that, both perhaps financially, but also kind of for infrastructure skills, and just feeding into that wider conversation. So I think there's some key things that came through around that, and our role, I guess, now is to go away and look at how we move that forward. What we're hoping to do is to kind of issue a briefing following this discussion. We'll need a bit of time to kind of expand on some of the points raised and kind of bring those together to start looking at. I think Tim Moran laid down the challenge of that roadmap. Quite whether we'll be able to do that yet, but I think we can start looking at some of those questions and bringing out a bit more detail on how we move forward, and then, you know, finally going on to looking into more detail at the specifics to do with buildings, vehicles, and the supply chain. So the next stage will be very much to try and put the discussions today into writing, if you like, pose ourselves some questions, further questions, and perhaps some pledges back to our members on how we'll move forward. So you can hopefully expect to see that in the coming weeks and months. And I'll be a bit clearer with the timescale on that, I think, as we move forward. There's clearly a lot to go through and a lot to kind of work with others on as well, to gain that expertise and make sure we're not just kind of going out on our own here, that we're actually, you know, feeding into the wider community, and lots of other organisations, some which were mentioned, that are looking at decarbonising the cold chain as well. So yeah, I think based on that, we would really, hopefully that today's session has been really useful to everyone listening in, certainly as to me, and hopefully the panel as well. But we would love to work with all organisations, members, anyone who has an interest in this, to help us in this area, to help us you know, deliver the best for our members, and hopefully for the society as well. So please do get in touch with any further questions you've got. We'll circulate, I think, the kind of net zero setting the scene report again to everyone who's listened in, so that they can look back on that. And just a mention as well for our Cold Chain Live event back in October, we had a whole month of kind of content relating to this subject. Lots of great presentations, interviews, blogs, all sorts of things, and that information is all still on our website. So definitely a sort of plug for that. So if you've kind of piqued your interest a bit on this topic, to look back on some of the stuff we've covered already. But hopefully that's okay, Shane.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tom. That's great. I thought you did a very good job there, actually, of summarising the key points. So hopefully everyone sort of recognised the themes in there. Just finally, in terms of events coming up, have you got just a kind of flag for those before we?
Yeah, I have. So sorry, as well as moving forward with hopefully briefings and some guidance on this topic, we're also going to continue kind of the events we've already been running on this topic. So in March, we're going to look specifically at decarbonising transport and transport policy. So that's actually not just decarbonisation, but also kind of the air quality agenda, which is very high on the government radar and also operator radar at the moment. So we've got 2 days dedicated to policy around temperature control, distribution, and also innovations. And there's lots of things coming through at the moment that will hopefully help us reduce kind of all types of emissions from transport. So that's on the 16th to 17th of March. And then in May, kind of ahead of the COP26 conference at the end of the year, we'll be focusing again on sort of climate change and again looking, hopefully updating you with our work in this area and having more, again, speakers coming in and talking about kind of policy and the raft of sort of government policy around climate change we're expecting in the next few months.
Thank you, Tom. That's fantastic. I've gone over by a minute, which is very bad of the chair. So thank you all very much. Can I say thank you very much to you, Alan, to you, Judith, Tim Moran, Tim Fox, and Toby Peters for your sharing your insights with us today. You know, Cold Chain Federation, when we launched Cold Chain Federation a year and a half ago, we made it very clear our mission was to be the forum for discussing these issues for the benefit of operators in the UK cold chain. This has been a great example of how we can do that. Obviously, we've only just skimmed the surface of some of these topics today, but the whole point is to basically take that and build on it from here. So thank you all very much for your time. Thank you to everyone who's taken part, you know, great attendance throughout the session. So thank you all. And please get in touch with us if you've got insights and things you can share, as Tom said. So thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of your day and the week.